Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Jim Petrowitz, and I'm the Director of Business Development for Auros Knowledge Systems. Again, thanks for attending this beginner track session. This first one is entitled The Fundamentals. And our presenter today is Josh Kullis. Josh is a Technical Services Manager and Knowledge-Aware Consultant at Auros Knowledge Systems. Before I turn it over to Josh, I want to remind everyone to keep the chat open and feel free to enter comments or questions during the session. And we'll have a few minutes at the end to address those questions and answers. But without further ado, here's Josh.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Like Jim said, we're going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals. So Jeff Moffa, Jeff Mayhew, they went through some conceptual examples. They talked a little bit about the concepts of the knowledge-aware approach. And we want to go a little bit farther than that in this presentation. So we're going to walk through some information as far as, how do we identify assessments within our organization? So the two fundamental concepts of knowledge aware are going to be the knowledge packet and the assessment. And we want to know, how do we identify those assessments? So Jeff Mayhew talked about starting with assessments first. We'll go through some of the ways that we can pick points in the organization out where an assessment would be useful. We'll then talk a little bit about what those look like. We'll also talk about knowledge packets and identifying knowledge packets. How do you do that within the different places that you may use an assessment control? And we'll see what those knowledge packets look like as well. So to start off, when we're going into an organization and we think that there's value for the knowledge-aware approach, identifying assessments a lot of times will be difficult to do. We don't necessarily know where they should go. There's a lot of different places where knowledge exists. So how do you actually identify where the assessment control is going to present itself? And we've, over time, come up with some things that we find fairly common as we go to different organizations as good indicators of an assessment control and where they can be useful. So the first one is going to be where the omission of knowledge is painful. That's a little odd when you say that term, but in general, we're talking about areas like a checklist. So checklists exist because they're a list of things, right, that you want to make sure you do before moving on from an activity. And the checklist is a good indicator where, if you do not think of something, or if you omit knowledge at a particular point in time, it's going to be painful. Maybe a mistake was made in the past, and you don't necessarily want to make that mistake again. So anywhere that the omission of knowledge is painful, we have checklists. A lot of people have lessons learned process for things like this, but that's one indicator of where an assessment can be valuable. The second one is where you're going to have the need for traceability and audit. And the design review process that Jeff Mayhew talked about is one of those things, right? You have a lot of different stakeholders that are coming together to make a decision. And in that particular instance, you want to track what that decision was, maybe all the reasons that the decision was made, some supporting evidence, that kind of stuff. That's a good place that an assessment can provide value for an organization. And then the last two are fairly similar, but we kind of split them up because there's two distinct ways that Auros does the last two items. But it's anywhere that a standard process exists or anywhere that standard work exists as well. So a standard process, something that every time you do an activity in your organization, there's a process that you're supposed to follow. Auros can help with that. The assessment control can track whether the process was followed, if it wasn't followed, why it wasn't. And then the same thing with standard work. Maybe you don't have a process, but you have a list of items that need to happen every time an activity takes place. That standard work can also be tracked in an assessment in Auros. So now that we have some of the indicators for where an assessment is going to be, why don't we talk a little bit about different use cases? So we'll walk through some use cases here. We'll talk about the way that some of our customers and even some of our workflows internally use the software. And then we'll show you what those things look like. So our first use case is going to be something that one of our customers does. They call it workstation readiness. And essentially what happens is they have people that are walking the manufacturing floor, and they're making sure that all the different workstations are ready so that when the plant opens and they start running the lines, everything that's needed for a particular workstation to stay up and make sure that the line continues to run so it doesn't have to be taken down is important to them. They have a checklist for that particular thing. And that checklist has been turned into a use case in Auros, and it's going to look something like this. So very similar to a checklist that you might see in an Excel file, but there's a lot of functionality around this assessment control that doesn't necessarily exist in an Excel file. We're going to be able to access information, track that information, and then provide insights back to users through the use of the assessment control. But in this particular use case, there's a list of items. Are the chemicals labeled? Are ergomats in place? There's different things that have to be done in order for the workstation to be safe, in order for it to maintain productivity throughout the life of the line. So these things are very important. And this is one use case of where a checklist existed. That checklist was turned into an Auros workflow, and that group runs multiple different assessments using information across multiple plants all over the globe. So our second use case that we're going to talk about is similar to a checklist, but this is the traceability and audit. So the example that Jeff Mayhew gave earlier on was a design review at Navistar. This use case is the design review as well. So an assessment control has multiple people coming together. They want to make a decision on the particular design. So they're going to capture the different design criteria in knowledge packets. They'll put those knowledge packets into an assessment control based on context, the part that they're working on, the assembly they're working on. And then they're able to track adherence to those items in the assessment control. So the first thing that we'll notice is this looks very similar to the assessment control that we just looked at for workstation readiness. That was a checklist. This you can consider a checklist as well. But one of the things that Auros tries to do is make the user experience consistent from one activity to the next. So what I mean when I say that, a lot of times we'll have an Excel file managing a checklist and it functions one way. Then we go to another Excel file and it's formatted very differently. A lot of the functionality that exists in it is going to be very different. So it's hard for users to understand how to interact with those things. With Auros, what we want to do is we want to take the need for people to understand how to use the document or how to use the checklist. We want to take that out and we want to allow the assessment to provide consistency with the evaluation process. So even though we're doing two very different things, one particular case, we're filling out a checklist for workstation readiness on a manufacturing floor. This second case, we're making decisions about a design in the product development phase. The visual representation of the assessment control and the functionality and the way that you're going to evaluate is going to be similar from an end user perspective so that we don't have a lot of the difficult processes that we have when we're managing knowledge through documents. So our third use case is going to be the process, so standard process. Internally at Auros Knowledge Systems, we use the software to manage the implementation process of new workflows. So our assessments actually look like this. We have a process, it's depicted, and as our application engineers are going through implementations with new customers, they're going to follow this process, and we're making sure that things happen in a linear fashion if we deem that they should. And then the standard work, which we'll get into here in a second, at each one of these steps is going to be applied and used consistently across all of our implementations. So we have different steps in our process. As you get to certain steps, we're going to deliver information into the process, and the standard work that needs to happen at those different steps will be tracked, monitored, and applied throughout the life of the project. So standard process is the third use case, and then kind of dovetailing off of that, our fourth use case is going to be the standard work. So I talked about how we have different steps in our process. This is another process within our implementation phases. And you can see in the middle of the screen, there are 11 items at a scoping session step. So as we go through the initial parts of the project, we're going to talk about scoping the project out. We want to understand what kind of value we're going to get out of it. We want to understand the items that are going to be within the scope that we're going to focus on while we're doing the project. And there are a lot of best practices and standard work associated with the scoping session itself and coming up with what the scope of the project will be. So in the fourth use case, we have standard work, and that standard work is going to present itself to people similar to the way that we saw with the workstation readiness checklist and the design review checklist as well. So we want to reduce the need for people to understand documents, but there are a lot of different use cases, a lot of different ways that the software can be applied. And ultimately what we're trying to do is prevent recurring mistakes and allow ourselves to continuously learn and grow the knowledge base so that we can improve over time. So those are 4 use cases for assessments themselves. But what are the knowledge packets? How do we identify the knowledge packets in those areas? If we go back through the 4 types of assessments, the omission of knowledge is painful, or we have a checklist, a lesson learned. This is going to be the easiest one to identify our knowledge packets. Because essentially, as you go through the checklist, and it isn't always this way, but what we'll generally see, at least for a starting point, is the items in the checklist are one-to-one with the knowledge packets. So if you have a checklist with 20 items, you generally will start off, at least in the beginning of your implementation, with 20 knowledge packets, and then you create your assessment with those 20 knowledge packets. If we go down to the need for traceability and audit, this one, it's not as easy to kind of point them out and to understand what actually goes in the knowledge packet. But at a conceptual level, if there are decisions being made and there are items that need to be audited, let's say you need to make a decision on how thick a part is. Your part thickness may be a knowledge packet. The different things that exist in ISO audits, there's a big list of items that you have to adhere to in order to be ISO certified. Those generally what we'll see is those items become the knowledge packets. And then in the standard process and the standard work, similar but not always exactly the same, the steps within the process. So if you have a 4-step process, the steps within it, those generally will be the knowledge packets, maybe phases if you want to go one level up. And then the standard work is just the collection of items that needs to be completed. So we talked a little bit about that scoping session. There are different aspects of a charter that we produce as the last step of that scoping session. And those items that go into the charter would be the standard work in that particular scenario. So we have knowledge packets for those items. So if we take a look at what these things look like, excuse me, we'll start off with workstation readiness. So we have our checklist again. There are a lot of different items in the checklist, making sure that the station is ready to go. And if we open one of these knowledge packets up, are the safety signs posted? One of the things that you'll notice is the template for the knowledge packet looks similar to a document to some degree, but we want to drive consistency into the capturing of knowledge as well. So not just the evaluation of knowledge, but the way that it's captured and the way it's presented to users a lot of times can be different, right? We may have a PowerPoint from one group, a PDF from another group, a Word document, Excel files. There's a lot of different formats that people can capture knowledge in. And what we want to do with Auros is we want to try and take all of that noise out of the user experience. And we want to provide consistent communication of knowledge, regardless of the group that it's coming from. So in this particular use case, we want to know if the safety signs are posted. There's some background information that you can see in the rich text fields, but then we also have a multimedia image that kind of gives us an idea of what those safety signs should look like, right? So this would be an example of a knowledge packet in the workstation readiness group. If we go on to the second use case, and now we're talking about a design review, we may have different design requirements or best practices that need to be adhered to. And those knowledge packets, if we open one of these up, are going to look very similar to what we just saw with workstation readiness, because again, we want to take the need for the user to understand the actual mechanism of capture. We want to remove that from the process. So even though we're capturing information that's very different from posting safety signs, here we're talking about the pin engagement of a locator pin, the visual representation of that information is consistent. So we still have the rich text at the top. We have our multimedia section. This particular knowledge packet has a value table, which we'll talk a little bit about in some of the sessions later on today. But we can actually model the knowledge and allow end users to not have to interpret rules that we're trying to put in. So we can see that down below the multimedia. But the main thing here is that the visual representation of the knowledge packet is going to be consistent from the workstation readiness group to the design review community, where we're capturing very different things. But from an end user perspective, visually, it's going to be similar. So our third use case, we talked about process, adhering to process, delivering information into the process. And the knowledge packets here are going to vary from the two that we just saw, and that's because we have this depiction of process. So we'll have a lot of information similar to the last two knowledge packets. There are some rich text fields that we can use. We have multimedia fields, but generally what we'll see is a knowledge packet like this is going to be participating in your assessment. So here we can see the knowledge packet. It's a representation of the same process. And the only difference between what happens with the knowledge packet itself and the assessment is that here in the assessment, if I remove the knowledge packet from our view, we can see the different steps in the process. We can see some green halos. There's some timing flags there. And we can understand how the knowledge is being applied. And if we're in a green state, if maybe we had some risk associated with this project, we would see red halos instead of the green. But the knowledge packet is going to be a representation of the process. And instead of making a copy of that representation, this process is actually participating in our assessment control, and we're just capturing how information is being applied and adhered to in that particular project within the context of our activity and what we're doing. So if we then go down to the fourth use case, which was the standard work, so this was the scoping session that we have. Our assessment looks similar to workstation readiness. It looks similar to the design review, and it's being delivered into the process assessment that we had before. And if we look at one of the knowledge packets in this particular assessment, sorry about that. It's again going to look visually similar to the workstation readiness and the knowledge packet for the design review. So we have the rich text areas up at the top. This particular knowledge packet doesn't have multimedia, but we can see if there was a value table, it would be positioned here. And we have metadata and other information down at the bottom. And again, the visual representation, even though we're capturing something very different from a workstation readiness item or very different from a design best practice or requirement, the visual representation here is going to be consistent across all three of those different use cases. So I know we're running up towards the end of the presentation. We got about 8 minutes left. So we talked about how do we identify assessments? What do they look like? So again, we want to see anywhere that a checklist or the omission of knowledge is painful. The second one is going to be anywhere that you need traceability or audit capability. And then the last two, which are kind of similar, but Auros has very different ways of actually depicting these things. Anywhere that a standard process exists or you have standard work that exists, those are good areas for an assessment control to provide some value to your organization. And then we walked through what they look like. We also talked a little bit about identifying the knowledge packets in a checklist. It's generally the items that are in that checklist. For the traceability and the decision making, what are the decision points that exist in the process? What are the things that need to be audited or need to be traced? And then in the last two, the standard process is simply the steps within the process. And then the standard work are the items within the standard work or within the collection of standard work. And we took a look at what those knowledge packets look like as well. So I think at this point, Jim, are there any questions that anyone has? Feel free.
No questions yet, Josh. One comment, though, I think it's important to point out. Mike Flores, thank you for pointing this out. He said maybe it's just me, but I cannot read a lot of the slides. I think it was particularly, Josh, when we put up screenshots of Auros, we know that font in the screen itself was really small. I just say to you all, apologize on our behalf. We're all learning in this virtual world on how to best represent this conference. But we will, upon request, be sending out copies of presentations after the conference is over. So if there's anything that you need, feel free to reach out to any of us individually. But we certainly want to make sure you get the information that you need. We did have one come in here from Sung Young at Hannon Systems. In general, how long do you recommend for the whole setup for the new project? If I want to make it as a real job in our company, the required CAPEX might be several hundreds.
Yeah, when you're starting off a project, we have a standard process that we kind of looked at when we were going through use case 3. And that process of onboarding one workflow, we typically say takes 15 weeks. So we've done it in as few as 2. And we've also done it as many as 20, 25. We don't recommend that just because we want to start to see some benefit, earlier than 20, 25 weeks. But generally, I'd say 15 weeks. And similar to what Jeff Mayhew said in his presentation earlier, the implementation of Auros, or the knowledge aware concept, really doesn't ever stop. So it's kind of hard to put an endpoint on that. We can onboard workflows generally in 15 weeks. And then as you start to onboard workflows, and we'll talk a little bit about getting started, I think, here on the 3rd breakout session for the beginner track. As you start to grow the system, you start to become more mature, you get to the point where you have this enterprise capability, and there really is no end to that particular thing.
Thanks, Josh. We actually had another one come in from Dave Matthews at BE. I think he's at BE Systems. Forgive me if I got that wrong. Yes, I'm right there. I know he asked this question in the last session too, and it didn't get addressed out loud. So I think it's great that he's asking it again. He's asking, what kinds of systems are replaced by Auros when implemented?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a question we get a lot. And we sometimes, and Jeff Mayhew has actually had conversations with me in the past, they kind of give us a hard time because we'll get questions like that. And a lot of times the answer is, well, it depends, right? Auros is a very flexible system. It is very adaptable to the things that you need it to do. So in some organizations, it replaces systems like program management. It replaces systems like issue tracking. But in other organizations where they have very established systems for those things, and there may be different reasons that you wouldn't want to replace those items, Auros is going to be able to come in and fill the gaps of the processes where, right now you may use Excel, or you may use Word documents or PowerPoints. So the one thing that I would say every implementation does experience is it's going to replace the document-based things. So Excel files, anywhere you're using Excel files or Word documents or PowerPoints, those kinds of processes, a lot of times the document makes it difficult to manage the process. So Auros will replace those things. And then as we go beyond those types of document-based processes, replacing systems like a program management system that might be at your organization today, Auros can do those things. And it really just depends on managing the change and the cultural acceptance of it on whether or not an organization does replace those systems.
We actually had another one come in, Josh. Dan Hurd from FCA asks, do you anticipate ever providing citizen-developed workflows?
To this point, I think we have talked about adding things like workflow management tools and those kinds of things into the Auros toolset. Right now, we don't have any plans, like concrete plans to do it. But as the use cases continue to increase, Jeff talked a little bit about team boards, and he talked a little bit about methods in his presentation where, as those use cases increase and we get more feedback from the user base, things like incorporating workflow tools into the system and some sort of a workflow-like management process is definitely something that we're open to. We just don't have any concrete plans to do that at this point in time.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Sung Young, and thank you, Dave, for the great questions. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Josh, for the presentation. That's really all the time we have for this session. We're wrapping up in here in a minute or so. Thank you all for coming. Again, please reach out to Josh individually if you have additional questions or if your questions weren't addressed here. I'm about to paste a SurveyMonkey into the chat. If you wouldn't mind, please taking a moment to fill that out. We would greatly appreciate any comments or feedback that you have on the session. And then our next one, beginner track number 2, is coming up at 2:50, so in about 5 or 6 minutes. And that's going to all be about knowledge modeling, and Josh and myself will both be there as well. So again, thanks for coming. We hope to see you in a few minutes, and that's the end of the presentation.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you soon.